What have I done? Have I touched it probably?
Sorry?
Showing that on the screen behind it. There we go.
Good morning, everybody. I think we'll make a start. We've got a good audience. The sun is shining, although I was commenting earlier, the windows are somewhat Dickensian. They do need a clean, I think. My name's Philip Selwood. I'm the chair of Zemo Partnership, and we're hosting this morning's event. But just to say, first of all, just on domestics, there is no fire alarm planned. Should a fire alarm go off, it is genuine, and we make our way down the stairs, and the muster point is cockpit steps, which is just round the corner for those not familiar. I'm actually just the stand-in chair this morning, the sort of warm-up act, if you like, because we've got a proper chair coming along shortly in Lord Deben, but we'll come to that. I just wanted to make, if I may, a few initial comments before we kick off. Quite a lot of people have asked, why do we need a council? Why now? What's it going to do that's different? And without stealing any of Claire or John's thunder, it won't have escaped anybody's notice that there's a small matter of an election going on. We will have a new government in less than a month. So actually, not that this was planned, this is a very timely moment in terms of influencing the pivot to delivery in terms of net zero for transport. And it's deliberately targeted at net zero for transport across the entire landscape. And that's the reason why we feel this is a different sort of initiative. Obviously, transport is everybody in this room knows it's highly complex, and it represents still the first or second, depending on how you calculate it, the largest target that we need to deliver on in terms of emissions reduction, both for 2030 and for 2050. Secondly, it's a systemic problem. We often view these things sectorally, and of course, if you're in the freight business or if you're in the passenger car business, it's absolutely critical for you to be delivering on that sector. But the reality is that transport and mobility, like energy, is a systemic problem. And at the moment, we're not really looking at it in a systemic fashion. And that's really going to be, I think, one of the key factors in why the council will be different. That will require an examination, dare I say, of self-interest and quite a lot of trade-offs, because it can't be delivered in one sector and not in another. That isn't going to work. So it will require some pretty hard discussions. There's a necessity for collaboration, and we think that the council we've pulled together represents not only at an individual level, but at an organisational level, an opportunity to really drive that collaboration across the transport sector. And the reason why we think Zemo is well placed to launch it and help manage it is that we've got a 20-year record of partnership working, whether that's with government, whether that's with the private sector or the third sector, or indeed all together at the same time. And there aren't many models out there, certainly not any in transport, I don't believe, that really represent that level of collaboration. And when you think of, just two or three of the things that the Zemo partnership and previous to that, the low carbon vehicle partnership has delivered, some pretty thorny subjects, the launch of E10 as an alternative fuel in passenger car, The whole car labelling scheme seems a long time ago now, but that was actually quite difficult at its time. The management of the Secretariat of the Electric Vehicle Task Force, bringing together lots of different interests, not always necessarily aligned, and that's really the purpose of the partnership model. The only way you can actually solve these problems is sitting them down and talking about them, not just exchanging mortar fire across the trenches. It's currently a pretty tight council. We've got 14 members, and I've already been approached by a number of organisations saying, well, we want to be part of the council. Lord Deben may comment on that, but I think the reality is that if we're going to really have influence and tightness, 14 is about the maximum. That does not mean that we're not going to be consulting across the rest of the stakeholder landscape. Clearly, trade associations, private sector bodies, third sector bodies, civic society need to be part of the solution. And we'll be saying more on that after the first council meeting that takes place in July. But rest assured, we will be doing our very best to remain as inclusive as possible in terms of all stakeholders. So that's enough from me, and just really leaves me to introduce our chair, John Gummer, Right Honourable John Gummer, now better known as Lord Deben, but I'm sure everybody in the room knows of him because of his background and his experience. We're absolutely delighted that he's agreed to chair the council, and he's going to manage this morning's proceedings in terms of the panel and to introduce what I hope you'll think after the event has been a stellar group of panellists discussing some of the key issues and barriers that net zero transport faces. So thank you very much, and over to John.
Well, thank you very much. You've made my job very much easier by putting forward exactly what this is all about. The fact is that if you've been a politician for a long time, you discover two very important things. One is you should never leave governments to make decisions about industry because they always get them wrong. And the second is that governments don't want problems, they want answers. And if you think of those two things together, if the industry doesn't provide the answers, then the incoming government will have to do things itself. And it will get it wrong. That's not a party political thing. It doesn't matter who is the incoming government, they'll still get it wrong because they don't know about the fundamentals of delivery. Governments are very good at policy very often and appalling at delivery. Chris Stark and I have spent almost 11 years running the Climate Change Committee, and the point about the Climate Change Committee was that every single one of our budgets, all the policies, all the things that we were saying were passed almost unanimously by the Houses of Parliament. But when it comes to delivery, governments are very bad at it. And it isn't just this government, which was very bad at it, but it would be almost any government has real difficulties at actual delivery. And that is not just about the subject. That's about doing anything, because it's the nature of government. It's not what government is instinctively good at. And that's why the relationship between the government and the doers has to be as good as you can make it. And the whole idea of this council is that we bring the doers together so that we can work out how best to deliver, because we know we have to deliver. And I want just to emphasise for a moment about the having to deliver bit. The point about climate change, which people forget, is that it gets worse every year. Whatever we do, it's going to get worse every year until we've actually conquered it. And then one has some hope of pulling things back. But until that happens, it will get worse every year. And that means that every year, more and more people will be affected. And they will be more and more angry that people haven't done it 20 years ago. Even though 20 years ago, they spent their time trying to stop people doing it. It's what I call the Tesco test. You remember those days in which nice people used to say how terrible it was that Tesco was taking over the high street. And they'd say it over a dinner which was entirely fed by food from Tesco. I mean, they managed to do it that way. And I think that's exactly where we will be with this. The very people who have been most noisy about not doing the right thing will be the people who will most demand. And what they will say is, why didn't business do it? We know why the government did it, because it's hopeless, but that's how they always think. But why didn't business do it? I mean, I am furious, for example, with the house building industry, which has gone on building crap houses, which have all got to be actually retrofitted, even on the basis that the government hasn't acted. Well, I blame the government, but I also blame the industry, because that industry is going to have a huge bill in the end for what it has managed to do, because it didn't think forward. And it didn't go to the government and say, this is what we want as changes, so we all have to do the same thing. Instead, what it did was to try to push those changes off, particularly Persimmon, which spent a long time not doing the things and pushing it off. Now, I don't want this industry to be like that, and I don't think it is like that, because you have the great advantage that a lot of your customers in various sorts and parts of the industry are already demanding standards which really have to be met. So we know that within the industry itself there are those pressures. But it's also true that what we have to do can only be done if it's thought through, and it's thought through in a way which doesn't disadvantage bits of the industry, but really is a collaborative and cooperative activity. Now, what I hope we'll be able to do is, we've already mentioned the question of the number of people on the council. We don't want a council so big as you as you have to address a public meeting every time anyone says anything. But what I hope we'll be able to do is to set up also an advisory committee where we can put on all those people who have an interest, so that we can regularly get their advice and then occasionally have meetings with the council, so that together we can make sure that each step, the big steps we take as a corporate activity. Now, the third thing I do want to emphasise is the importance of all of us being in this together. That's not that's not a kind of wartime thing, we've all got to be in together because otherwise we all collapse, but it happens to be true. But we have to be all in it together, because the government will only listen to us if we're all in it together. The danger always is that most people want to do this, and some loudmouthed individuals over here want to do something different. And the government, then two things happen. Either the government doesn't do anything because it says there's disagreement, or the person who's got the loudest mouth wins, whether it's the right thing or not. So we've got to get together to make sure we decide what it is we want to say to government. One of the things I do is to chair PIMFA, which is the organisation which represents financial advisors and wealth managers. And we never got anywhere when there were two groups. There was the wealth managers and there were the financial advisors. And one lot thought the other were inferior to the other, and the other one thought the others were snooty. Won't tell you which is which, but that's what they used to think. Now we've got together. We've had an enormous effect on government. We really are getting the delivery that we want, because the government can't say there's somebody else who's got a different view. And so that's why this unity is absolutely crucial if we're going to get what we need to get, which is a proper delivery mechanism which takes the whole industry together and which is sensibly thought through for the real problems that we have, and where government buys into it so that they can provide those things which we can't provide for ourselves. That's the mix that we really have to do. And if we do that, we then begin to come to that fourth and last point, which is that what we then begin to do is to do this in the most cost-effective way. Because in the end, this can either be relatively cheap in the sense that we do it in the course of business, or it can be extremely expensive because it's forced upon us at a time that we're not ready by a government that doesn't understand and asks us to do things we can't do. And it's so noticeable that, and I just give you one example of that. In my business, Sancroft, where we advise people on sustainability all across the world, we spent many years advising Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola realised, not without a certain amount of pressure from us, but they realised that they couldn't go on using HFCs in their refrigeration. They're the biggest purchasers of refrigeration in the world. And HFCs are a potent global warmer. And they realised that although they could go on for a little time, gradually governments would stop them. And then they'd be forced to change out of pace. So they worked with Greenpeace to work together to try to find an answer, because they had a different problem from anyone else. Curiously enough, ice cream people, perfectly all right, because you move ice cream as frozen. And therefore you don't need much butane, so you can have a pretty easy transference. But if you put in bottles of Coke or cans of Coke at ambient temperature, you have to lower the temperature very quickly. And therefore they couldn't use butane because they'd blow up. And they only needed one blowing up and they'd lose their business altogether. So they had to find an alternative. And it took about 10 years to do it. But when they did find it, they were then able to do this at the pace they actually could afford to do it. Now they don't use HFCs at all. But it has not been an expensive operation, because they've done it in their time, at their rate, and they've done it in a way in which they have not been enforced upon by government. Now, we haven't got that sort of time. They were sensible enough to do it quite a long time ago. We have got to do things more quickly, but we've got to do it in a way which makes it possible for the industry itself. So this industry, widely defined, has to come together to make sure that an incoming government has some answers, because it's going to have answers, because the questions are going to get more and more urgent as each year we find the situation of weather really changing. And we should remember that after the wettest winter we've ever had, and the heat being more than we've ever had it, I've got people living near me who've neither had a harvest nor have been able to plant. It's the most devastating effect. And if we have a summer like we're likely to have, then it'll dry out, but we won't have any water. And that will mean that people will be saying, why the hell have we been flooded in this winter, and we're so hot in the summer that my Aunt Agatha has died? That is not going to be good for any incoming government, and we're going to have to be part of the answer. So I'm so pleased that we have got this started, and we're going to begin with a panel, and then we're going to swap over and have another panel, but we're going to try to cover all the issues in that way, and we have got an extremely good selection of people in order to do that. But before we get on to that, we're going to have a word from Claire Haig, who's the Executive Director of the Zemo Partnership, and then we will move forward to the challenging parts of the panel. But first of all, Claire.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Absolutely delighted to see you all here. I want to start by paying tribute to the work of the Climate Change Committee. Underpinned by the strong cross-party consensus that has ensured that the UK became a climate leader, the committee's annual progress reports to Parliament have kept the focus squarely on net zero. Now, in recent times, there has been a certain softening and, should we say, nuancing of political support for net zero, and a somewhat unhelpful narrative has crept into the media. Now, this has had a direct impact in terms of confidence. The recent National Infrastructure Commission report highlighted that policy U-turns had caused uncertainty and delayed progress. And the recent High Court ruling that the carbon budget delivery plan is unlawful sets out the sheer scale of the challenge that will be facing the new government. So, the role of the Climate Change Committee will be even more essential than ever. Because, as Lord Deben has already told us, this is not optional. The net zero transition is not a nice to have. It is not optional. Every year that we fail to address this sufficiently signifies a steepening of the curve. The more we delay, the more the transition will cost, and the more adaptive measures we will need to put in place. The cost of insurance and all other costs will go up. Businesses understand that. Which is why it is so crucial that we focus focus on everything that we have to do to ensure the transition in an as orderly way as we can. So I want to turn now to really focusing on the sheer kind of scope, really, of the challenges that we have ahead, but also some of the challenges, sort of some of the opportunities. Because the UK, I mean, the policy U-turns that we've seen have there's been a very clear feedback from the business community that this kind of was not, this was not helpful. What we've learned, what we know is that businesses crave certainty. So what we need to see is a stable, orderly policy environment for net zero. And the UK has a strong track record on net zero. We can boast of world-leading growth in offshore wind and clean energy. Businesses have responded because the market signals have been clear. But having been trailblazers, then the UK now risks being outpaced by international competitors. So we need to move fast to seize the opportunities. And what we need is an ambitious industrial strategy would act as a catalyst for new technologies and innovation and bring jobs and manufacturing to the UK. So transport is probably one of the hardest sectors to decarbonise. It is a central part of the problem, but it's also a key part of the solution. And in the progress report last year, the Climate Change Committee noted that what we urgently need is to switch focus to delivery. When comparing the carbon budget delivery plan with the net zero strategy, one of the obvious changes was an increase in emissions from surface transport, and this is largely due to the fact that any estimates of savings that could be achieved by traffic reduction had been omitted from the plan. So what we urgently need at this stage in the net zero transition is a credible and detailed delivery roadmap. Zemo Partnership, as a key partner of government, has played a central role in the decarbonisation of transport since 2003. Zemo uniquely brings together industry, experts and government and is unbiased by any interest group. As such, Zemo is well placed to lead on the delivery on the development of the delivery roadmap. So since taking the helm at Zemo Partnership, I have been discussing with our members some of their priorities for the net zero transition. There is a strong feeling that the UK needs to double down on net zero policies. There is international competition for capex, and we need to do more to bring to root supply chains in the UK. But it's not just investment that's needed. We need a clear vision and a strategy, and we need to get on the front foot to influence international regulations. I mean, the net zero transition is forcing us all to think differently and to do things differently. This has to be a whole economy transition. So we need to move beyond the perennial problems of siloed government. We need, for example, to ensure that policies at DESNES are fully aligned with policies at DBT, because net zero needs to be understood as a massive opportunity for UK PLC. But we need to ensure that we support SMEs in the transition to net zero. We've made great progress in technologies for passenger cars and buses, but we still need solutions for freight, especially HGVs, and for coaches. 85 to 90% of freight operators are SMEs, and on speaking with the Road Haulage Association, I've learned that an alarming number of businesses are going under, and I have heard similar reports from the UK Coach Operators Association. We must avoid unintended consequences. We need to ensure that we put a spotlight on any potential dangers and trigger points in our delivery roadmap. We cannot afford for net zero to threaten jobs and livelihoods. That would be the quickest way to undermine public support and derail the whole transition. So our delivery roadmap for Net Zero Transport will be overseen by the independent Council for Net Zero Transport, chaired by and steered by Lord Deben. We are also delighted that the former Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, Chris Stark, has joined the Council and bringing from his new role at the Carbon Trust, bringing that perspective of businesses along with other leading business representatives. But in this delivery phase, it is local decision makers who will make many of the key infrastructure investments. So I am delighted that we have leading representatives from devolved, regional and local government on the Council. And we are also joined on the Council by some leading academics and by key representatives from consumer and environmental groups. So the Council will provide strategic oversight, but the delivery roadmap itself will be informed by a series of devolved and sectoral roadmaps looking at specifically personal mobility, public mobility, and moving goods and services. We're currently in the middle of a major project for the Welsh Government, decarbonising commercial vehicles in Wales, which will feed directly into the delivery roadmap. So the devolved and sectoral roadmaps will be discussed at Zemo partnership working groups, and we will come together for quarterly briefings to have progress reports here at One Birdcage Walk in this very fine council room, the next meeting being scheduled for the 3rd of September. So I will run through next steps and timetable at the end, but in the meantime, it gives me great pleasure to hand back to our chair, Lord Deben.
Well, now, I'm going just quickly to introduce each person as they speak, and I'm taking the list, the one that has been given to me. So the order is not my choice, it is the order which is down here. So there we are. So let us begin. And a great pleasure for me to invite Chris Stark, the Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust. What I want them to do is to say a few words just about how they see this initiative. And then we will have a discussion which will arise out of what they say, and I hope we'll get really good audience participation. So, Chris, let's start off with you in your new role as head of the Carbon Trust, about where you feel that we can fit into what you're doing.
Brilliant. Do you want me to do it on the mic? So, very good morning to everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Very, very good. And let me say what a delight it is to be back with John. So this is the first event I've done with John in my new role. And let me also make note that this is the first time I think I've ever worn a tie and John hasn't. So that's a sign of things to come. So I have moved to a new organisation now, the Carbon Trust. And the Carbon Trust has been around for a very long time, doing very interesting things, looking at across a whole set of sectors that it covers. In particular, how we can look at the impact that businesses are having on this issue of climate change. So way back when, we were the organisation that actually pioneered the whole idea of carbon footprinting. And we're in a situation now where you've got a lot of corporates who are either proactively deciding to look at their impact on climate and emissions with things like SBTi targets and target setting, or will be led to that by mandatory accounting rules, some of which I was involved with in my last role, putting a framework around that through things like the Transition Plan Task Force. So there's a whole movement to look at the impact that the private sector, corporates are having on emissions and how they could be cut into the future. And I'll tell you now, what's been interesting in the month that I've been at the Carbon Trust is that we are now in, I think, the second stage of that. You've had this sort of rush to set net zero targets at corporate level. Some of those very, very ambitious targets that have been set for example, 2030, now look extremely difficult to hit, because as we get into the topic of where those emissions actually lie in supply chains and look beyond what we call scope 1 and 2 and into the wider supply chain, what you find is it's really bloody difficult to cut emissions because we are fundamentally up against it. So those corporates that are committed to it, or those corporates that will be made to commit to cutting these emissions, are looking seriously at now what you can do. And what's my interest in this Zemo partnership is very simply that for most corporates here in the UK, transport emissions are probably the quickest way for us to actually tackle this in the wider supply chain. So if you're really up against it, you look at what you can do. Corporates right now today have, of course, the immediate tools at their disposal to cut emissions through the buildings that they might own, for example. When you get into the wider supply chain, it's transport emissions that are probably the most convenient way, I think, and the area of greatest opportunity for us to cut emissions quickly into the future. That shouldn't really be a surprise. If you look at globally where emissions from transport are, it's about a quarter of the pot of total emissions. That's true here in the UK as well. And it's exciting because we also know that in that sector, we've got the greatest opportunity to move quickly now. So it is as much an energy concern as it is a transport concern to cut those emissions, particularly through electric vehicles. Not just about electric vehicles, it's also about alternative fuels and about strategies to use less of existing fossil fuels. So all of this looks to me to be a huge opportunity. Now perhaps I might come to the challenge, and I'll draw from my last role as much as this one. For the business community trying to do something about this, they are being met by a series of confusing signals from government, and in particular in the last year. So we're in the midst of a campaign now, and I'm freed from the shackles I would have had in my last role to say this. The speech that the Prime Minister made in Downing Street in September last year was tremendously damaging on this. So very simply, and I'm sure you'll hear this from my fellow panel members in a minute, it does not make sense to say to the country, we will implement a mandate on the manufacturers of electric vehicles or vehicles and then tell the consumer, don't worry, you can wait. And the consumer is as much businesses as it is individuals here. So it is not acceptable for those signals to be sent out, because confusion means that the right investments do not get made in this sector. So for all of those reasons, my kind of number one thing is let's have over in the new government much greater certainty about what's actually going to happen, including some of those key dates. My second request, I suppose, and the thing that I will be making as clear as I can in my role in this partnership, think internationally about this. So as much as we are here in the UK and talking about UK policy, issues of freight, issues of the supply of vehicles, issues of transport more generally are international fundamentally. We are too domestic, I think, often in the way that we think about those things. So that means a whole host of things. In particular, thinking about supply chains and freight means that you must think beyond the UK, and that means tying ourselves into what Europe is doing especially. And that is a difficult topic, but one that we're going to have to confront. And the other one I'll raise is we are going to find this transition much more difficult if we move into the world that Joe Biden has moved into, of putting extra tariffs on cheap vehicles. And it is a King Canute style strategy to say that you're going to hold this up. So those cheap electric vehicles, which are my last role I promised were coming, are indeed coming now this year and in the year beyond it. We're going to see extremely cheap vehicles coming from China. And for the business community, they will want to see and access those vehicles and bring them into their own fleet. So that key thing is making this as cheap as possible means thinking very carefully about protectionism and those tariffs that we might choose as a country to put around those vehicles. That is a fool's errand from my perspective. And my last point is a fairly obvious point. If you want to see the electric vehicles transition happen as quickly as possible, it will probably be led by those fleet vehicles first, and that's what we're seeing already happening in the market. What holds that up is not so much the cost of the vehicles or indeed the tax arrangements for those purchases and for using those vehicles. It's the ability to charge it and to connect those vehicles to an energy system that is ready for that extra charging demand. So we need to think about rolling out those charging facilities across the country as quickly as possible with the minimum of delay. And that's a much broader topic, of course, than just charging. But the energy system needs to be ready for that. And I think here we have an important role to play in encouraging the new government, which is likely to be of a different colour, to adopt the right kind of planning approach to that so that we get this done quickly and don't see the barriers that we presently see through grid and the development of that grid, which will impact immensely on things like the rapid charging network that we need as a country, but also I think more fundamentally at the local level through the distribution network. We need to be ready for millions of those vehicles to be connected to charging points up and down the country, not just in the southeast. So that I think is probably the kind of major way in which we can make this thing happen more quickly. I'll stop there, John.
Well, thank you very much. And just a particularly important issue is that if we want to get the right signals for government, we have to give the government the signals that we want to get them to give to us. Actually, that's the only way you ever do it. That's why this is so important. And it's also why I'm particularly pleased to ask somebody from the SMMT, because obviously that's a hugely important part of this whole enterprise, not least because it's one of those organisations that politicians have heard of. I'm a great believer in trying to start where they are. So I'm very, very pleased that Constance Scharing, Executive Director, Government and External Affairs, has come, and I ask her to address us.
Thank you very much, John. Good morning, and thank you, Claire, and thank you to the whole Zemo team for inviting me along to speak today. So, as John just said, my name is Constance Scharing. I'm the Executive Director at the SMMT, looking after government and external affairs. But for my sins, I've got quite a long attachment to Zemo. 20 years ago, I helped set it up jointly with Professor Jim Ski. And I think somebody mentioned a car label. I think it was you, Philip, very much in the midst of putting this forward. So why do I mention this? Because I think it's really fantastic to see now where you are going next to focus on delivery. Because my proposition today is delivery is not for tomorrow. We are already in the middle of delivery, and there's already a lot that we can talk about and learn and need to adapt to get the ideas and delivery mechanisms that we actually need to make this happen faster, fairer, and everywhere. So really, I welcome the launch. My boss, Mike Horse, whom you might know, sits on the council, and he can't be here. He sends his apologies, but I hope I can give you some ideas as to where we are coming from. And I do want to start with a really positive message, and by saying that UK Automotive is actually leading the transition to zero-emission cars, vans, trucks, and buses. And I pick up Claire's point. This is not just about cars and vans. We need to try and transition the whole industry. We work even on off-highway and try and make sure that the big opportunities in the UK there, that we can do it. So really, we are delivering, but we can't deliver alone, which is why this initiative is absolutely critical for us. So let's take a quick look on what we've got and how we think we can make this to the benefit of the environment as well as the UK industrial base and the economy. So to cheer you all up, last year, our industry invested over 24 billion, committed investment of 24 billion in the UK. That is transformation of the industry as is, the industrial base. This will go into production, innovation, R&D, skills, investment that goes into vehicles, batteries, electric drives, R&D, and dare I say, many other technologies that are on the pathway and the transition, which is one of your keywords, to net zero transport. So these are really jobs and transformation happening here and now, actions securing jobs right across the UK. And I'm really pleased that we are very active, Neville and others are very active in the Automotive Council, which is really bringing industry together, similar to this approach, to try and really have clear signals to government and collaboration amongst the industry. What do we need to do to be the best place to make this investment? That's our task, really. We want to get it here. And look at our figures. We've just come out yesterday with our May market figures, and they're really promising. You know, we've had a tough time throughout COVID in overall market, but the one shining star, even in the COVID period, was indeed the transformation from very low figures for battery and plug-ins to now 16.1% on cars. That is really, really positive. And I know we talk about cars. I will talk about buses and coaches in a minute as well. So as we speak, the UK is the second largest BEV car market in Europe after Germany. And we are the leading, last year we were the leading electric vehicle bus market. These are things we want to drive forward. We need to create the right conditions that this is something that we can carry into forward, because competition is not sitting still and things will happen elsewhere. We want it to happen here. And it's looking good. You know, 2 weeks ago, we hosted our SMMT test day. We had around 300 journalists there. And the point of test day is that they can actually experience these vehicles, see how good they are, see that they are not easy and cheap. They're actually fantastic consumer products that will be desirable for consumer and will be in the future also ever more affordable. So really, we've got a wide choice of models across all the segments, 100 plus BEV models. That rises to over 300 plug-in models, and they are all across all segments, and they're rising even amongst vans and trucks. So it is really happening, this transformation. And we've got amazing offers on the market because we have to meet targets. Average range has increased, 236 miles. Some go now in excess of 450 miles. This is a positive story. And what this council is all about, to make this happening here and learn the lessons of what works, where we have problems, how we overcome it, and how we deliver going forward. So as an industry, we are delivering, but the challenge is the gap between where we are and where we need to be in light of the very net zero commitments we spoke about, and also in light of the regulatory framework, if we talk about cars and vans, the UK ZEV mandate. 16.1 is a good figure, but 22% is where all manufacturers individually have to be. There's a gap really that needs filling. Incidentally, if you put to the BEVs also the plugins, you could probably get beyond 22 things, something to think about. So moving on, instead of, I was asked to talk about key barriers, I think, Claire, but I think I want, rather than talking about key barriers, there are three key enablers that I would like to talk about rather than barriers. So the first one, you won't be surprised, is market incentives. And this is a difficult debate. Nobody wants to talk about that this is not cost-free as a transition if we want it fast and furious, but that is something that we need to do to try and help consumers, whether that's private consumers or whether that's in the future people and fleets that have to buy vans, trucks, or buses, operators on the buses. So we need a really grown-up debate about the costs and the consumers. We have put as part of our manifesto not only the ask for having a green automotive transformation strategy that is holistic, like you want to be, about how we achieve all of this, being good at emissions, being good at exports, production, but also at the market. But we also want net zero mobility for all. And part of that has been our call, which you might have seen out there, on fair tax for a fair transition, 3 measures that we think should be in the policy idea spot to try and drive this transition faster. The first one is around a temporary cut on VAT to 10% for new BEVs for 3 years, temporary. It's all about increasing in this critical period, given that the market is there to pull everybody else, infrastructure investors and others, giving certainty. We need to see something that could add 250,000 vehicles, totaling around 4 million tons over the 3 years in CO2 savings and 40 million over the lifetime. The second one is that next year, battery electric vehicles need to be exempt from the outdated 40k VLD threshold of the expensive car supplement. So this was put in place to capture expensive internal combustion cars. But as we know, it would cover almost 70% of the BEV market today. BEV market will change, but it doesn't help that it hits now. And it hits now in a market where people need to make a move. And as you know, expensive car supplement is not at the beginning. It hits you in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and year 6. Surely this is something that we have in our power, our government has in our power, to really help the second-hand market and residual values. And then last but not least, we are also part of that coalition that calls for an equalization of VAT for charging in public and at home. We think this is a very strong signal, given that we talked about signals are important, and actually a really clear barrier, a key enabler to try and get TCO better forward. So that's the first one, market incentive. Second one is the biggie, and that's infrastructure and energy networks. Charging anxiety, I think we need to move beyond that. We need to recognize enormous investment has happened. We are on a good path. A lot is happening there. But it's again about the gap between what is happening and what we actually need, both in recharging and refueling, to support all technologies that are on the pathway to net zero. So from our side, we believe, we think infrastructure targets should be binding. We can have a discussion around that. We can see what will that help with, what will that not help with. Will that help without money? Obviously not, but you need to have, if you want universal right of charging, you need to have something that ensures that wherever you live, you can expect that you will have the infrastructure, whichever kind of house you have or accommodation. So that's the first one, and as I said, the equalization. So really equity for those without a driveway, big incentive, big signal out there, and big impact on TCO. So really, a bipartisan discussion about infrastructure and charging adequacy, affordability, and accessibility would be probably something that would be fantastic to come both out of this, but there might be also other fora that Edmund and Neville will be on, I expect Neville will be on the EV infrastructure task force. So lots we need to do in that space. And then last but not least, regulatory framework. I think you said, Claire, or it was in one of your publications, we need to move from target setting to delivery now. But regulatory framework, they matter. The ZEV mandate gives us our drive forward, but we need to make it work. Our members are here to comply with it, but as you see from what you read in the press and what you can see happening in our market, it is challenging. It is good that fleets drive the market, but we do need the private demand. And if we see the private demand go down by 19%, we have a problem in moving forward. So make the ZEV mandate work, but also fill the gaps that we still need to fill. So we need to know where we are going on HGVs. We need to have the certainty on buses. These are all things that obviously we're now in an election period. We have to wait for, but we can't wait for long. And we need to all engage this to make it happen. So I'll stop here and only to leave you with the thought, delivery is a difficult animal. It is very timely that we look at it and need to achieve delivery. What's being done? How's it been done? What can we learn? Learning, consensing, adapting. That will be what we will have to do because we are learning now, but what we also need to learn going forward. So let's move from beyond delivery as compliance to a vision where we actually look at the UK as a thriving and successful ZEV market, producer and exporter, leading the transition in Europe, because we have the enablers, the ideas, and the collaboration that drives effective delivery. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I don't want to fall out with the SMMT, but I don't need to go far enough, you see, because I'm very interested to see that one of the big four of the auditors are taking the HMRC to the tribunal, because it turns out that the legal definition of domestic energy should include the energy you take for your motor car of the public system. That actually the HMRC has misinterpreted the law, because domestic energy isn't just what you take in the house. That's why if you go and buy a sack of logs, or you get some thing for your barbecue, you only pay the lower rate of VAT. And the argument is Deloitte's are taking them to the tribunal. And interestingly, the HMRC is busy trying to put the tribunal date off, because the advice is that it may be that they have to make this change anyway. I have a very naughty way of doing it. I think everybody should be paying for the extra weight they put on the system. And I think if people have private aeroplanes, perfectly happy for them to have private aeroplanes, but they should pay the cost to the environment on that. You could soon reduce the VAT on ordinary people's motor cars if you just did things of that sort, and it would make people understand that you really believe in the just transition, that the people who can should, and the people who cause the biggest pressures should either make the changes, which is what the industry is doing, or if it's a personal thing, should pay their part. So I think there's an awful lot that we can do, but I'm very pleased with Deloitte's having found this bit of the law, and I'm hoping that the SMMT won't have to fight its battle from then onwards. Right, so we now move on to David Wells, who is the Chief Executive of Logistics UK. I'm so old, I remember when they used not to be called logistics. I think it's the one.
Best thing we ever did, to be fair. So, good morning, everyone. Come on. Good morning. Good morning. You've sat here for a good hour. Well, 55 minutes. And, we need to liven this up. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Claire, for taking forward this important council, and also for inviting me to share my thoughts on decarbonising logistics. So I'm Dave Wells, Chief Executive of Logistics UK, been in the job way too long, 9 years. And John says we used to be called the Freight Transport Association. We changed our name to Logistics UK
And as I said, it was probably one of the best things we ever did, because we have always represented all modes of transport, but actually logistics has become a really vital sector for our economy. It employs 8% of the UK workforce, and we really need to have a powerful voice in this debate. So we do represent the whole sector, but I'm going to keep my remarks centred on road freight, although I will touch on the importance of mode shift for achieving net zero. The logistics sector is committed to decarbonisation. Let's just get that out in the room. We are committed to decarbonisation. Road transport contributes 9% to the UK's total emissions. So road freight contributes 9% to the UK's total emissions, and therefore we do have a vital and key role to play in achieving our net zero goals. But if there's one point I want you to go away with today, your one takeaway is that logistics decarbonisation depends on partnership. Partnership. We can't do this alone. Partnership is central to delivering a fair transition to a green economy. John mentioned it earlier. This has to be fair. And that will enable the logistics sector to keep costs down for customers and maintain supply chain resilience. And we've had some stark examples of what happens when supply chain resilience fails over the last few years. Logistics is not a sector that exists separately from the rest of society. Let me say that again. Logistics is not a sector that exists separately from the rest of society or the economy. In fact, it underpins the UK economy. So, whatever it needs to invest in decarbonisation is ultimately paid for by you. It's paid for by households, by businesses and public services. The challenge for the industry is that it operates on such small margins. I'm not going to ask you to guess, but it would surprise you, I suspect, that typically logistics operators operate on 3 to 4% profit before interest and tax. 3%. You don't have much room for error when you're running a logistics business. And the vast majority, as Claire said earlier, 80-odd%, are SMEs. Therefore, the industry struggles to invest, especially in new equipment or systems that are in danger of reducing rather than improving their efficiency. And that is a real struggle when you're operating on those margins. So it's important that the sector continues to educate the public on what we do, and dare I say it, on how you behave. So what is the true cost of a next day delivery? Do you ever think about it? Is it really the cost of your Amazon Prime subscription? No. Amazon Prime delivery doesn't make money. That may surprise you, but it doesn't. Do you really need that item you ordered on Prime next day? I suspect not. There is a statistic that says the average household in the US has 4 unopened Prime deliveries in the garage. I suspect we're probably not far off that ourselves. And where do those costs ultimately land? Well, they come back to you ultimately. The way we take people and businesses with us is important. It's also important to recognise that the logistics key to decarbonisation will have to take a variety of approaches, all of which have dependencies that sit well outside of its own control. This means we need partnership with government, we need partnership with vehicle manufacturers, we need partnership with infrastructure providers, and partnership, or at least alignment, between Whitehall, the devolved administrations, and, as we've mentioned earlier, Europe. Because there is only one truck manufacturer that actually makes trucks in this country, DAF assemble in Preston, but the rest of the vehicles are all European. So what's the challenge? Well, there is progress being made, especially in the uptake of electric vans, but even there, the pace of change, as we've heard, is not really fast enough. For vans and HGVs, there are some really tricky challenges, including the suitability of the vehicles, the cost of the vehicles, the residual values, the energy infrastructure, the regulatory barriers, and ultimately, a lack of a joint strategy between the sector and government. Although we are trying to make progress in these areas, I'll give you some examples. On viability, zero-emission HGVs are not yet technically or commercially proven for long-distance operations. And there is no agreed plan for low-carbon fuels, despite them being able to make a real difference right now. On cost, the average e-van costs 50% more than a diesel option, and coupled with recent uncertainty, which we've alluded to with the speech last September in the EV market, means that future values of these vehicles at the end of their lease means higher comparable monthly costs. Then there is the payload penalty, we call it. Because you've got a heavier vehicle, you can only put less weight in it. And that comes with using heavier HGVs and vans. And this means that additional, more expensive vehicles are needed to deliver the same volume of goods as required to do the job today. Then you have the challenge, if you have to charge a vehicle when the vehicle is currently used 24/7. If you spent £100,000 on a truck, you don't want the truck sat in the yard. You want the truck out on the road delivering goods and product and materials. If you have to take the vehicle off the road to charge it, then your efficiency drops and you need more vehicles. So it's a second challenge for the industry. On infrastructure, there are long waits to deliver depot charging, and the public charging network is not fit for purpose for commercial vans. It's built generally for cars, and the grid capacity does not exist in the right places to deliver HGV charging. I take the point earlier about planning. The point about we're building houses now that aren't fit for what we're going to need in the future. We're building warehouses that aren't fit for the future. We're not putting in the energy supply sufficient to charge HGVs electric in the future. We're only putting in the bare minimum that will cover the lighting and the warehouse management system. So there is a lack of intermodal facilities. Wharfs and rail electrification also inhibits modal shift. And this is a real missed opportunity as rail freight significantly lowers emissions. Electric vans are being restricted by regulations designed for HGVs. Currently, HGV weights and dimensions regulations create a payload penalty, as I said, and logistics operators now face a patchwork of rules and regulation in urban areas. This is our one pet hate. Devolution sounds all very grand, George, but the reality is we've now got a patchwork of regulations and we're adding inefficiency into our transport system. Instead, we need a planning reform which will create space for logistics, opening up new ways of delivering urban logistics, such as small zero-emission vehicles for parcel deliveries. Finally, and most importantly, there is a lack of a plan. A joint industry and government strategy for delivering logistics decarbonisation. A UK-wide and accepted plan is needed to address the challenges that are set out and many more, and also to give the sector confidence to invest. So where next? As I mentioned earlier, there's good work starting to take shape, and Logistics UK is leading a project for the DFT Freight Energy Forum to map out future energy demand across the UK and inform energy infrastructure decisions. To reduce queue times for energy upgrades, we also support the reforms announced by the Chancellor for energy networks to move to a first ready, first served model, and are engaging with the Energy Network Association on the details. However, government is currently reviewing mode shift revenue support, which is a big concern for us, as is the fact the Scottish Government has pulled out of funding modal shift. There's engagement in the devolved nations, and we've worked with Transport Scotland on its HGV decarbonisation Pathway for Scotland report, which sets out the challenges to overcome. And we're feeding into the Welsh Government's freight and logistics plan, and we're working with the Zemo partnership on the Welsh CV decarbonisation project. So overall, we want the next UK government to show much more commitment and joined up thinking across Whitehall to develop a co-created logistics plan with the sector for net zero and the phase out of fossil fuels. Without this partnership and without this plan, there is a real risk that decarbonisation imposes unsustainable costs on businesses, public services, and ultimately households. And in short, what do we need from a new administration? We need leadership. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. The truth of the matter is that leadership is exactly what we need, and it's not just leadership, but it's joined up thinking. The fact that there is so much silo attitudes in government and in businesses, as you all find in the businesses with which you work, when one bit doesn't know what the other bit's doing, and so you find yourself in a real difficulty because of the interconnection between logistics, for example, and the main business. One of the things that I'm very keen about this new council is that we're trying to set an example by not allowing the industry to be siloed. And if we don't allow the industry to be siloed, I think we have some chance of making sure that the government isn't siloed. But without that, then we will be doing all the things which we don't want the government to be doing. And that's why we have to set that example. So I'm very pleased then to have the last in this first panel, which is Elizabeth de Jong, who is the Chief Executive of Fuels Industry UK.
Fuels Industry UK is delighted to be part of the Council for Net Zero Transport. I'm certain the Council will be focusing on solutions, but today I've been asked to set out headline challenges and barriers. The fuel sector can play three critical roles in the effective and efficient decarbonisation of transport. Firstly, the sector is able to deliver low carbon fuels at the scale required to decarbonise the existing vehicle fleet, so that decarbonisation can start now without relying on consumers choosing to buy new vehicles. In 2022, we delivered 3.3 billion litres of renewable fuels, and that's the equivalent to the removal of 2.6 million cars from UK roads. Secondly, the sector is vital for electric vehicle manufacturing. You might not know that, as over 55% of components by volume are made from hydrocarbons from our refining processes. Thirdly, our sector has the potential to deliver the UK's aspiration to be world leaders in the production of sustainable aviation fuels. But to deliver these, we need a more coordinated and comprehensive approach to policy making in order to attract investment. Philip called it a systemic approach. Without investment in the fuel sector, there's a high risk of a slow, disorderly transition to net zero, comprising of peaks of consumer demand as those legal dates approach, fuel supply droughts, and consequent volatile prices. But investment decisions for our sector are taken by multinational companies, and UK projects therefore compete against those elsewhere. As the UK has a higher cost base and lower margins than many competitor countries, there's less of an incentive to invest in lower carbon fuels here without a really strong policy support. However, policies affecting the sector are located across many government departments and at least 41 policy areas. Individually, each policy may be being optimised, but the collective impact is not assessed, and so together there are unintended negative consequences. We need to address the disjointed nature of policies for our sector. Despite acknowledgement that they are important to 2050 and beyond, the low carbon fuel strategy has been delayed for many months, and we've not had any inkling of content which might encourage investment, such as bolstering consumer demand. The road transport fuels obligation has impacted emissions, but further progress is limited because the main trajectory flattens after 2032, and it's a volume-based obligation. Basing it on greenhouse gas emissions and introducing demand incentives would make it more effective. We know that government is keen to be a world leader in sustainable aviation fuels, but we have concerns about whether it can be viably produced in the UK. SAF production also makes other lower carbon fuels as a byproduct. Demand for these byproducts makes the cost of producing SAF more commercially viable. But a narrow policy focus would remove that demand, and without the demand for those byproducts, SAF costs may rise in the longer term. Multiple project, regulatory and planning delays experienced here increase the risk of project delivery and cost, so that future investors are less likely to invest in the UK. Delays can come from environmental permitting and planning applications, particularly when new technologies are deployed. We also have concerns that processes for developing end-of-waste criteria for different feedstocks are not yet fit for purpose, and partly that's due to upfront funding being required. We also believe that transport decarbonisation is undermined by a singular focus on tailpipe emissions. More options would be available if policies were technology neutral and used a life cycle approach. That means evaluating the entire environmental impact of a product, from extraction and processing of raw materials through manufacturing, distribution, use and final disposal. When we meet government, we ask that the fuels sector is fully considered and properly represented in policy decision making. Specifically, we are requesting that there is a dedicated sponsor team looking at long-term fuel policy, a policy statement to provide a coordinated strategy, as the last one was in 2014, and improvements to the representation of our sectors in the models used by policymakers and also on key government advisory boards. I'm really looking forward to working with all the council to help put in place the more coordinated and comprehensive approach to policy making that I and other members of the council are all asking for. It will start with industry. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Now, we've got a short period of time for people to put any points to this panel that they'd like to. So have I got anybody who wants to pick up any of the issues? I think we've raised some really important issues which we can, and there's a lady over there and she is going to start, and then a gentleman there. So let's start with you. I wonder, could I just ask you to pass that over? I think we're a bit short of those. Thank you.
So, hi there, thank you. So actually I'm Lorna McAtee, I'm head of fleet at National Grid, so I kind of have several hats. I'm also deputy chair of the Association of Fleet Professionals. Actually, the one thing that struck me with all of the decisions and discussions that you very kindly put forward, we're missing one subsector in everything we're talking about, and that's the blue lights and support services. They don't get the opportunity to take the grants that other people do. They don't get the opportunity to move, and yet we expect them to support everybody else in this transition as well. So if you take the likes of the fire services, who actually, some of them are damaging because they're telling businesses you can't put electric vehicles inside at the moment. We need to have a really serious look at how we can support them, change whether they have protected status or not when it comes to electricity in the future, and understand that. So I just wanted to raise that as we always seem to forget those services as well.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman at the end of the row there.
Thank you. This is on? Yeah. Kamal Panchalan from the Local Government Association. So what I've heard so far is tend to be a little bit one-dimensional. I've heard about transitioning from one type of fuel to something zero emissions. What I've not heard about is actually there are other means of getting to net zero and decarbonising transport. So, you know, the most environmentally friendly, the greenest journey is the one you don't have to make. And the next one is the one that you get on the, you know, you use active travel, you walk, you cycle, and then public transport. All of these measures are also alternatives. So I'm hoping that the council will go much beyond this sort of transitioning to EVs and look at all the other, because there are benefits, there are vast numbers of other benefits around reducing congestion and tackling air quality and promoting sort of active living as well. So I hope that's not forgotten about.
Well, I think the next panel will certainly pick up some of those things. I have no doubt about that, because what you've said is absolutely essential, as indeed was the point that you made. I'm so pleased you did that, because otherwise we would have missed it from the discussion. I think we're going to come back to you. Gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Jamie Wilson from Alexander Dennis, one of the UK's bus manufacturers. I recognise the challenges that you've outlined, and certainly we are very supportive of helping with that, as always with Zemo. We've been a long-standing supporter. What I see is an affordability challenge. I think you mentioned that at the beginning, John. It's going to cost money to transition, but we also have hidden costs. If you look at the kind of net cost by carbon footprint per capita of our imports and exports, we're actually offshoring a lot of our dirty secrets by buying stuff from more polluting economies elsewhere in the world. So localising it through the LCA analysis, Elizabeth, that you mentioned, is really, really important. And I feel as a UK manufacturer, you know, it is really important to preserve UK manufacturing, because actually to achieve low carbon and lower emissions through the whole cycle, not just through the use of the vehicles, but through the full carbon footprint, it's essential to support British manufacturing and keep us viable through this time in the face of very, very low cost competition, which is obscured by obviously the carbon sink there. The other challenge I see is that, you know, the critical mass, if this goes unchecked, with increasing connectivity with our transportation network, you know, through not just connected vehicles, but ultimately autonomous connected vehicles, of course, which we're very much a player in the market with. You know, we've got to think about what the transport vision of the future for UK is, and do we want a sort of foreign nation with potentially different political ideals in control of our transport network, giving them the headwind of low-cost transformation into low-carbon tailpipe emissions, but not low-carbon full-cycle emissions. So I think it's really important to see the full picture, not necessarily just part of the picture, as I guess we're laying out here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. A very important series of issues there. I was passionately interested last night. If you haven't watched it, get it on iPlayer. The edition of Country File, which was about D-Day landings, and it is so well done. But in the middle of it was a discussion about how we had so depended on import of food that when the war when we needed the D-Day landing, it took us 2 years to prepare the food industry to produce the food that we needed before we could actually do what we needed to do as far as the D-Day landing was concerned. And although I agree with Chris about not going right the way down the Biden route. I do think we do have to think about the way in which we can transition without losing our independent ability to do the jobs that we need to do. I think there is a balance to be brought around here, and there is no doubt that the Chinese are weaponizing climate change. It's brilliant, and it should have been done by the country's free enterprise. I mean, we should have said, climate change is happening, we're going to make a business out of it. And that's exactly what the Chinese have done. And that's why almost every photovoltaic cell you've got is made in China, and why the Chinese have really gone in for electric cars. They have a much longer term way of looking at this, and we've got to have a much better way of handling it. But just protectionism will not solve that problem. We've got to find other ways of doing exactly what you say. Now, there's time for one more person if there is another question. There's a lady at the back. Thank you so much. Do say who you are.
Hi there, I'm Sophie Ogunby from Toyota Motor Europe. Thank you very much. I just wanted to follow on from the colleague who spoke slightly earlier. I think there's been a really strong focus on battery electric today, and I just wanted to make sure that the Council has got scope and ability to talk about the role of hydrogen, because hydrogen will play a really important role in decarbonising transport. And I think this is a really key opportunity with any incoming government to make sure that hydrogen is on the map, hydrogen transport, hydrogen economy, hydrogen infrastructure. So I just wanted to raise that point.
We will certainly be taking hydrogen very much into account. The one thing that I am always worried about with hydrogen is that it is sometimes presented as a get-out clause for politicians. Hydrogen economy, we're all right, we'll wait and we'll have that. And that is not going to happen. And we must be very careful about both including hydrogen properly, but also not seeing it as the answer which lets politicians off the hook. I'm always looking out to make sure politicians don't get off the hook. I was a politician for long enough to know that that's rather important. Very well. I am not. I am an ex-politician. Right. Very well. Now I'm going to thank the team, ask them to move from where they are and get the new team up at once. And while they're doing it, will you please clap them for what was a really interesting introduction. Right. Very good. Okay. Well, we haven't time to wait while they put the new water on, but new water will come. I want to say that one of the things that I am so pleased about, and it wasn't my decision at all, it was already there when they asked me to be chairman. One of the things I think is so important is that we recognise that this whole battle is going to be won by everybody. And that means that we don't divide people off and say, well, there are NGOs over there who are great campaigners, and then there are politicians, and then there are people in the industry. We really do have to learn about things from every point of view. And so I'm very pleased that we're going to start this panel by asking Dr. Doug Parr, a very old friend, the chief scientist of Greenpeace, who's been very instrumental in making sure that Greenpeace has known its facts, and that has made it much more effective than some other organisations that haven't known their facts. And the only time they really came a cropper was when they didn't get their facts right. That was not Doug's fault. Doug has always been very careful to get the facts right. So I'm very pleased to ask him to start off this panel. Doug.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. This frenetic time, I'm stuck in the middle of, signing off press quotes in the middle of listening to our very lovely speakers on the first panel. Anyway, that's beside the point. Thinking about challenges, I suppose I group these into three, because we are at a particular phase in the political cycle, and You know, for Greenpeace, we are about creating space for political space for the right things to thrive. And we can do that in different ways. We can do that looking at industry, but we quite often look at the government. And it's always been clear that tackling climate change is about the public interest inserting itself into a system where vested interests will inevitably want to prevent change because that affects them. And in that context, what government does and what government says matters. And what we need to see is a new government making and indicating the right signals to the community that will be represented on the council and more widely about what direction we're travelling in. I was bitterly disappointed by what Rishi Sunak did last September, because as John and others have said, you know, that is the signal that creates the confusion. There is confusion already. We know the Environmental Audit Committee saying, particularly about electric vehicles, I think they used a term like tidal wave of misinformation coming from different parts of the media. And so what government says by setting out, clearing away the detritus and saying, this is the way we're going. And we may not have all the answers, but this is the way we're going. It's a thing they've got to do, and we want to see the new government reassert that with reasserting the 2030 target that the present government resigned from, and establishing other targets with roadmaps for other sectors, including the HGV sector, the bus sector, and so on. Now, of course, that's all very well, but as others have said, we are now in a different phase, and it lays down challenges to the environment community, including Greenpeace, because we're moving from the politics of the politics of vision, I would call it, to the politics of delivery. Although if you were unfortunate enough to watch the prime ministerial debate last night, there may not be much politics of vision on display there either. However, at least nominally, we are moving to the politics of delivery, and they're more bitty. They're more technical, and it's important that they got right in a situation which is not always in the right place for doing it. One of the examples I would have is that the UK is one of the most centralised countries in Europe in terms of its political governance. And it means that local authorities do not have the resources, sometimes the powers, but certainly the resources to do the sort of things we badly need for decarbonisation. You see that very particularly in the decarbonisation of heat. But it's also true in the decarbonisation of transport. We have got to solve the problem of those people who do not have a driveway, a private source of charging. Now, that inevitably is about where do these charge points go? How do they relate to those areas that have no charge points? There are certainly in national policy decisions about VAT on off-road charging, but we need a set of innovative solutions to get the right way out through that. And one of the things that devolution could allow is for those devolved administrations or local governments to try stuff out. And some of it wouldn't work, of course it wouldn't. But if you're trying to innovation, of course it doesn't work. But we need innovation to try and find some of the right solutions. And at the moment, we don't have a political governance system that allows it. So that's one of those things where I think we're not quite in the right place. And, it would be good to try and create, as a group, the political space for some kind of change to happen and to allow that kind of innovation and to take place. The politics of delivery is also thorny, as you might see around sort of low traffic neighbourhoods and so on. That it's about bringing people with you And I don't think we've nailed the consumer journey yet. I've mentioned the kind of tidal wave of misinformation that appears in certain publications, which is having an impact. You know, I had a friend who, you know, routinely canvasses for the Green Party, kind of asking me about how dreadful electric vehicles were, and was I going to, you know, get Greenpeace to campaign to stop them. I mean, you had to put it right on that. But, you know, the fact that this kind of nonsense had reached people like her, I think was rather telling. And there's a wider case about the politics of delivery and maintaining the mandate to do it that is around the industry, yes, jobs, economic well-being. I mean, again, you know, there is a politics of vision here that we're still lacking, even though it needs to connect to the politics of delivery. This morning, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, put out a new report talking about investment in the clean technologies, which include grid and electric vehicles, is now twice that is going into fossil fuels. So in case anybody hadn't noticed, the international clean technology race is on. And again, you know, I'm not sure how many people realize that within the political system, that we are in danger of being left behind. And with that will go the wealth and prosperity and the jobs that could be sitting in the UK. And with that goes some of the mandate for the kind of changes that we need to see. It also means, however, the politics of delivery means thinking about those people who are at the sharp end of that. Now, it's of course right that we think about those people in the sort of centralized assembly plants around electric vehicles, but there is a legion of people with, you know, really great kind of on-the-job vernacular knowledge about how to get cars moving, but it's mostly situated with internal combustion engines. What are those 50-odd-year-old people going to be doing when the change happens? How do we ensure that it is fair to those people as well? And at the moment, the just transition is sort of confined to conversations about places like Port Talbot and the east coast of Scotland, where there are big communities of people who are potentially challenged by the changes that are going to take place as a result of a shift away from fossil fuels. But there are also a lot more people out there who are going to be affected, and we need to be thinking about them as well. Right, I've probably gone on a little bit too long, but just I want to say a thing about demand reduction. With the caveat, you know, if the polls stay as they are, etc., etc., it looks like we're getting a new Labour government. They recently put out a policy document which said, we will set targets for modal shift to lower emissions from the transport sector. That's kind of interesting. I mean, it's something that, you know, the green community has been asking for really quite a while. But if they're going to do that, then they'll need some measures to make that happen. And you can't botch your low traffic neighbourhoods like some local authorities have done, unfortunately. But we can learn from international experience. We can learn from the ways that buses and rail have been electrified elsewhere. We can learn from the climate ticket experiments that have been done very successfully in Austria, Germany, France, Spain, and so on. And we could install a transport system that gives more options to people, like the Swiss-style standards of performance and connection of that public transport system, and this kind of investment in walking and cycling infrastructure that we still need. Finally, I'm just going to say this once and let people shudder. Pay as you drive. Sooner or later, we're going to have to open up that conversation as we shift to electric vehicles. I think it's something that the sector, by which I mean everybody in the transport sector, should have a conversation that might be quite robust, but we're going to have it because the governments, particularly in a period of financial stringency, which will reach at least to the end of the decade and probably well into the 2030s, is going to need to be looking at revenue from the transport sector. And if it's not done fairly, then the whole thing, the whole mandate for the transition is going to unravel. That's enough from me.
Oh, thank you very much. And don't let's kid ourselves. The next government is going to have a very tough time, whatever it is. Just remember, when the Labour Party made that perfectly right, absolutely right decision, that they wouldn't have extended the North Sea oil and gas exploration, which was a disgraceful decision by this present government. When they did that, who were the first two people to attack them? Unite and GMB, the two biggest donors they've got. So it's a tough world that we live in, and I think that Doug is absolutely right to remind us that as you move into delivery, you move into technology and to difficult questions to ask. And can I just agree about road pricing? I thought the Greater London election, the election for the mayor, was the worst election I've ever seen operated. A crass Conservative candidate who never discussed any of the issues that really mattered about London, and all she did was to talk about the badly put into action of the mayor. I mean, there was no doubt that the extension was a badly done one, but it was necessary. We need to do something about clean air. But just to attack it as a total concept, instead of understanding that these are things that we're going to have to face. And if there's one issue that we know is going to happen, there is going to be road pricing. So stop making it a terrifying thing and start working out how best to do it. Of course there's going to be road pricing, because there ain't another way of moving from where we are to where we've got to be. So don't refuse to talk about it. It's like the Victorians refusing to talk about sex, but quite a lot was going on. And therefore, it's quite a good way to get on with it. Now, we've got to be quite tight on things, so I must shut up, and therefore, but I can't resist the odd comment, and therefore, I'm very pleased now to introduce Fiona Howarth, who's the Chief Executive of Octopus Electric Vehicles, very keen on Octopus, so there we are, you've got a very, very ready audience.
Thank you. Well, what a pleasure it is to be here. And I know we're focusing on some of the challenges, but I just wanted to pause and think about how far we've come. So earlier, Chris, you said around how much of an opportunity we have in transport. So I got back into EVs 2017. There was 5 cars that could go. And apologies to the person also that picked up on the fact that we're talking a lot about EVs particularly. But it's kind of a huge opportunity, one of the biggest levers we could pull right now in terms of carbon. So I'm going to focus mostly there. There were 5 cars that could go over 100 miles on a single charge. 5. And like 2 of them were like astronomically expensive. And the other 3 were pretty Marmite with the kind of like BMW i3 and stuff. And notoriously hard to get a hold of, right? You couldn't test drive one for love nor money. And now, last week, we held an event. We lease electric cars as well as do charging and energy tariffs. We hosted an event with over 80 different unique electric vehicles from 41 different manufacturers. 33 of them you can buy, 33 of those manufacturers, you can buy those cars today on the roads. Those other 8 are imminently launching. And it just shows the pace of change now that we're facing. And that's like double what we had last year and double that from what we had the year before. And the pace is significant. And that's matched also by the charging rollout, which also the rollout is going at pace. It's really hugely exciting. So I think we're now into that delivery phase, as you talk about, Doug, and it's kind of problems to solve. But I'm starting in a very optimistic place in which like there's a lot of opportunity now to make that change. I typically focus on 3 areas: vehicles, charging, energy system. And in terms of vehicles, there's kind of 3 things I really wanted to call out. One is, it is a global market. We need supply of cars. It's a supply-driven market. And so we need to make it very clear that we want those cars. I think the ZEV mandate has been very strong at being able to do that. Recognise it was matched by mixed messaging back in September. But the ZEV mandate in itself is very strong in terms of doing that. Recognise the headline number is 22% at the moment, but actually there's a lot of kind of flexibility within that. So to be able to meet that Actually, the UK car manufacturers need to get to about 17.6% actually this year. If you look at the new automotive numbers, year to date, they're at 16.9% as an industry. So although there might be some car manufacturers that are behind, others are ahead, and collectively it's in a very, very strong position. If you want more details, I would encourage you to speak to the new automotive team on that. The second one is, absolutely, though, we need consistency and we need to stay firm on that, to combat some of the misinformation. There is a lot of vested interest, which I think has been mentioned already. We've talked in the last few years of some of those car manufacturers having their Kodak moment if they don't invest in the future. And unfortunately, some of them are behind. I recognise there's other challenges as well in terms of the global context, which I do think needs to be addressed probably as well. But I don't think that we should, just respond to those that are most noisy. I think you referred to those that are often loudest. There's a lot of very positive numbers. So if you look at people like BMW, Mercedes, they're ahead of the game in terms of their ZEV mandate deliveries, as well as obviously the EV specifics. There are challenges as well as the misinformation, though, around the second-hand market, which we should not be naive to. We've got a lot of dealers that are nervous about selling the vehicles. The sentiment challenges has also hit them. And so that's impacting what they're telling customers that are coming in to buy the cars too. So we need to tackle the second-hand market. And then finally, there was a mention around skills and repairs and after sales. That is a challenge too. At the minute insurance is going up, some of the insurance companies are struggling to kind of get the skills they need to look at some of these cars. They're writing off EVs more quickly than they otherwise would do because they don't have the skills. We need to address that, or else it will become another knock-on impact and slowing the transition. For me, this is all about removing those barriers so we can go as fast as possible. And really, the transport sector can be the winner in the net zero race over the next few years. The second big area after vehicles is around public charging. I think it's fantastic. By the way, the ZEV mandate is really important to provide that confidence around arrival of these vehicles so that they've got utilisation of their charging infrastructure. So the ZEV mandate has a second piece there to provide confidence to investors. And so that is happening. We're getting a rollout of charging infrastructure at pace. We need to ensure it's reliable and digital first, because actually a significant part of the charging experiences now is going to be digital in terms of how you find a charge point, book your charge point, pay for your charging. And so having a really reliable digital first charging infrastructure is critical. And then, of course, these are batteries on wheels, and we are rolling out renewable energy at pace that we need to be able to store for when we want to use it most. And so making our energy system able to connect up to those EVs, whether it be just simple, flexible energy tariffs or vehicle to grid, is really critical. So there's a strong partnership there with the energy system. So vehicles, ZEV mandate, firm, it's going well. Tackle this misinformation piece, dealer, second-hand market and repairs, and then digital first, reliable charging, and a smart energy system. But I'm very positive. I'm absolutely delighted to be sitting here with such experts as we problem solve together.
Well, thank you very much. And we ought to remind ourselves that at the heart of all this is the grid. The grid, the grid, the grid. If there are three words to say, it is that we have to accept that that is going to be one of the biggest issues, and the technical issues in that, actually, Doug, some of the most difficult things to overcome. Just a simple thing is, why does the national grid not have the right to use batteries as part of its operation? Simply because of some historic reason. And yet you need that, because that would stop you having to reinforce the grid in quite a number of places. But nobody talks about it, and of course it's rather complicated. And immediately you start talking about it, people turn off. And that's one of the problems that we have for delivery. Right. One of the other problems we have for delivery is the time, so we have to be very, very much quicker. So I've now turned to Professor Gillian Annable, Chair in Transport and Energy, ITS of Leeds University. Here we are.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so my hopes for this council, and I'm delighted to be sitting on it, but I have to say that I'm apprehensive, if I'm honest, because The main message that I feel that we as a council need to put across is that it's not just about the scale of the problem. We can talk very well about the numbers, the figures, the budget that the transport sector needs to achieve, what it needs to achieve by certain dates. But we're not talking enough about the fact that it's not just the size of the pot, it's that transport has the greatest delivery risk around it. So, of course, all the things we've been talking about this morning, all the experts we have on the council are here to be able to highlight those risks and put forward solutions about those risks. But what still isn't happening, and that I feel we need to do, is to stop denying the real sectors and the real changes that need to be made around road and around air. So the Climate Change Committee has now finally, I have to say, explicitly come out and said that we need a review of the roads programme and that we cannot have any more expansion of airport capacity. What's happening in policy? We have no policies around either of those two things, which are responsible for the vast majority of emissions in the transport sector. And instead, we have an incoming Labour government so far, with their nice words around modal shift, who are peddling, frankly, the continued myth that the scale of the changes that we need to happen in passenger transport can be achieved through some form of modal shift. Public transport and active travel do and can only ever represent and contribute to a very small proportion of the carbon savings that we need to make in passenger transport. So there have been many, many pathway scenario models now for going back a decade, because I know, because I've been responsible for them, talking about the fact that even if we achieved all the wonderful targets around EVs, HGV acceleration of new powertrain technology, that we still need at least a 20% reduction of car kilometres by 2030, and that was based on 2019 levels, right? And that's 20% everywhere. That's not just 20% in the centre of Bristol or Manchester. In fact, the Bristols and the Manchesters have to reduce by 60, 70, 80% in order to allow other parts of the country to reduce far less. And that cannot be achieved by modal shift. Also, analysis of the National Travel Survey, and including analysis of what we do here in Britain on average in terms of our flying behaviour, shows that 60% of the miles that we do as people are undertaken by 3% of trips that are undertaken. And those 3% of trips, 60% of miles, are responsible for 70% of carbon, because they're carbon intensive trips. They're undertaken in larger cars, and cars that probably are going to be trips that are going to be less likely to be done by EVs for quite some time, and they're done by aeroplanes. Where is the policy around longer distance travel and actually reducing the distances that we need to make? So there are a variety of things that I want to see us do in the council, and one of the things is to shout down, if you like, or stop perpetuating the myths and the language around we need active travel, we need public transport, not talking about the fact that we have to shrink the size of the cars that we're driving around in. Also the electric vehicles as well. We talk about the grid. The grid can't run to stand still because of the size of the batteries that we're going to need to put in our vehicles. We need to talk about things like the fact that it's not some number like 40%, only 40% of households don't have a driveway, so it's going to be fine. What's the proportion of cars that are parked on the street overnight? That's more like 60 to 70% of cars. These sort of numbers we have to actually shout down at every opportunity, and that's not that's not me not taking into account the fact that we need to take solutions and not problems to the politicians. It's that the politicians cannot, and we cannot, put forward suggestions about solutions unless we're honest about the scale of the problem. And then that also transfers into discussions about what we're expecting the public to do. Now, I'm usually known, and have been in most of my career, known for being a behavioural scientist and talking about consumers and how we bring consumers on to this journey. But one of the things that I really try and fight against is that there isn't some sort of separate strand of behaviour change policy that we need to get government to do. And that's not what I see my role as. I'll sit here and talk about how we design some behaviour change policy. It's all behaviour change policy. Every single policy that we're talking about, technical, non-technical, pricing, regulation, it's all behaviour change policy. But in terms of actually thinking about how to make all of those policies politically acceptable, because that's what we're talking about in terms of consumer journey, then we need to be very honest as well about the scale of the problem and the trade-offs that need to be made, such as, do you want to reduce the amount that you travel, or do you want to reduce the size of the cars that you travel in? Actually, they have to do both. But if you talk about trade-offs, then there starts to be much more political acceptability for some of the things that we don't talk about right now or won't go to those places. And then finally, and I'm sorry to finish on such an even more negative note, but we're not going to hit the 1.5 degree target. And there are only two futures as regards passenger travel. And both of those futures involve a much lower amount of travelling that we're doing. One is that we try and achieve the best carbon reductions that we can to keep us as safe as we can. That involves less travel. Or we just face the fact that bad things are going to happen, and that's going to involve huge amounts of cost, huge amounts of disruption. It's happening now. Roads buckling, rails buckling, extreme weather circumstances that mean we're going to be doing less travel just because of that. So that is a future we're talking about. So we have to talk about much lower amounts of travel and be very honest about that.
Well, now, a bit of a clap, please, because there is no point in us having a council if we don't have a real range and we don't have people who remind us all the time about there is no simple way of just passing over the real problems. We can't do that. So I'm very pleased. Leeds has been an enormous leader. Oh, that's wrong. It's terrible. I didn't think of that. That Leeds really has been in the forefront of the work that we've done. It's done hugely well in its relationship with its local authority. I'm very proud of what Leeds has done, and it's set a real example. And we're very pleased to have you with us. And no doubt you'll be very infuriating quite a lot. But that is what you're there for. So thank you very much. Now then, I'm afraid that the last speaker is being corralled into one corner. And Edmund King is the president of the Automobile Association. And I'm, in a sense, you're perfectly the right person to round it off, even if we haven't really given you enough time.
Thank you very, very much, Lord Deben. Firstly, I'm delighted to be involved in this council, and in fact was involved with Zemo as the low carbon vehicle partnership 20 years ago, labelling of cars. So I'm going to talk a bit about the consumer, but also from the AA as a business as well. You know, the AA represents something 14 million motorists out there, but we're also a business, and as a business, and myself personally, we are committed to net zero. And as a business, we're committed to net zero by 2035. And that is pretty challenging as a business, because I think, as Chris said, something most of scope 1 and 2 emissions come from transport. And in our case, it's 97% come from our vehicles, because we rescue people in vehicles and we need vehicles to rescue them. And it's quite interesting when you break that down. Our vans make up 88% of our vehicles, 65% of the emissions. Trucks, though, so our recovery trucks, our big trucks, just 7% of our fleet, but 35% of our emissions, and our cars 5% and 1% of the emissions. So, putting that into context, you can see where the real challenges are. And we're delighted with our trucks. A couple of weeks ago, we actually announced a kind of test and learn, and we've brought on board 3 big recovery trucks that are zero emissions at use. And we are testing and learning, but it is quite a sacrifice. It costs us more, and we've got to think about things. But also, we're looking across the board. We're also using on some of our diesel vans, we've piloted in Manchester, using HVO or hydro-treated vegetable oil. And the beauty of that in this trial, you don't have to do anything with the diesel vans. And actually, emissions on that are down by about 95%. And I think it's Zemo approved for that. So we're looking at that. We do also have a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, but I'm not sure that that's the future for our fleet. Now, obviously, as an organisation, you can't change overnight, and AA has some specific problems. Towing vehicles, a lot of the EV vans haven't got the towing capacity and all of that. But, we're willing to test and learn. When it comes to consumers, I think this is really important. It's been mentioned before. There is absolutely no doubt, because we've got survey figures over the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever, but the adverse media reaction, particularly to electric vehicles, has had an adverse effect, and it has put people off. We can see from the surveys we did 2 years ago to the surveys this year, the likelihood to switch to EV has changed. But actually worse than that is some of the environmental issues. Only 51% actually think EVs are better for the environment. So that's consumers. Only 49% think they're better for air quality. And yet anyone who's lived in London for 20 years, when you walked through London and got home and blew your nose and you had diesel soot coming out, air quality in London is a lot better. But it just shows what a challenge we've got. When we look at what will your next car be, then 28% petrol, 32% hybrid, 7% plug-in hybrid, 6% diesel, 6% electric. Diesel, interestingly, though, I think the message has got across there, because net diesel was -20. So I think people have, finally got that message. But the electric message, we've still got a lot to do. And it is the old things, 70% think EVs are cost too much, 59% not enough charge posts, 42% can't charge at home. So, there are issues, as others have said, that need to be addressed. And I do think for a new government, one of the other issues is around accessibility. So that's accessibility of charging posts and all of that, making them accessible for disabled people, elderly people, and all of that. But also accessibility when it comes to levelling up, because frankly at the moment, if you're one of Fiona's good clients, it's great if your company offers you company car, salary sacrifice, you live in an area where you've got off-street parking, so if you've got all of that, you're quids in. If you live in a council block where you haven't got salary sacrifice, you're not quids in. So there's a lot of levelling up that needs to be done there. There is one other thing, though, with consumers, and Annabelle knows a lot about this, that it is the way we approach them. And what consumers say to us, they don't want to be preached at, but they want the right information, they want accurate information, and they want that to help them. Now, luckily for us at the AA, when you actually ask them, well, who do you trust to do that? They do see us as a trusted party to do that. So I do think there is a big role for organisations like us working with the council to help that transition, to give people the confidence. You know, we talk about it. Our members aren't hostile to EVs at all, but they are hesitant. And probably realistically with good reason. You know, this is the biggest change for 50 years, 100 years. So I think we've got to understand that as well and help them along the journey. And certainly that's something I'm looking forward to trying to contribute along with the council and all the colleagues here. Thank you.
Well, what a good ending to the group to talk about both the consumers and the challenge of information. For me, the Climate Change Committee has constantly said to the government, the real problem is that people don't understand. And they also are wary. Of course they're wary when they're spending money. And it isn't fair that you don't help people to make these choices. I can only say, of course, there's always a good excuse. First of all, of course, the press have run that. Who do you think's paying for it? We know precisely where all that's coming from. It is a concerted effort, and it's very determined, and we're seeing it all across the United States, and most of it is actually coming from the companies concerned. There's no doubt about that. And the truth is, you have to tell people what is your own experience. I've got a problem because I actually have a Tesla, and therefore, of course, they immediately say it's very expensive. But they do get quite interested when I say I've had it for 3 years and it's just had its first service. Then they think, how interesting. Apart from the tyres, I haven't done anything to it at all, and it's immensely cheaper to run. And when I work out what it's cost me, it is remarkable. Now, more and more of the cars coming on the market are doing the things that Tesla did. The clever thing about Tesla was that they designed it from the bottom. They didn't take a non-electric car and electrify it. They actually started at the bottom and did that. Now, we're going to have a lot of cars like that, but we have to explain to people in language that they understand. The one thing we can all say, which cheers us up, it's nothing like as difficult as trying to explain to somebody what a heat pump does. Anyway, I want to say thank you to both panels. I think we have been incredibly lucky. I've learned an enormous amount myself. I think it's been really valuable. I hope everybody here has felt that they've covered a whole series of things which they perhaps weren't absolutely knowledgeable about. I think we're very lucky, and I would like to thank all those who've taken part and say, if that's the level of intellectual input that we can have in this council, we're going to do very well indeed. So can we give both panels a good round of applause? I'm sorry that there hasn't been enough time to ask questions of the rest, but we are going to have a little refreshment in the other room afterwards, and I think all members of the panels will be around, and you can beard them then. I'm going to finish, as one should do, with where we go from here. So I'm afraid that the truth is that Claire hasn't got much time, but Claire Haig is going just to do where do we go from here in the speediest time she's ever done.
I will save time. Thank you, everyone. This has been absolutely brilliant. We're at the start of a long road, and this is the first of many quarterly briefings, so I really look forward to future discussions. I will save time by just directing you all to our rather lovely brochure, which sets out the timetable of key milestones going forward. I mean, the key thing is we've started, we're on the journey together, and huge thank you to everybody as well. May I also extend my greatest thanks, sincerest thanks. And I'm going to hand back, there you are, that was quick, hand back to Lord Deben.
Thank you. Well, we're going to adjourn now. I hope everybody will adjourn. And I just want to say one last thing, which is this. We will only make this work if we have your input. It'll only work if we continue what happened today to keep ourselves really where we need to be. We are not going to be a council which sits there in serious contemplation of our own navels. What we are there for is to be the creators of a changed economy, which means that Britain will keep ahead of the rest and that our industry will be successful because we will do the transmission, the change from one to the other in a way which is cost effective, business friendly and sensible and realistic. We're not going to miss out on the fact that this isn't an easy transfer. It's a very difficult one. And if we face the difficulties, we're likely to win through. So thank you all very much indeed.